killing two birds with one stone your thing? How about a few birds? Then the outlandish turducken could be what you need this Thanksgiving.
Crispy on the outside, juicy on the inside.
But whose twisted mind came up with the idea of stuffing a chicken inside a duck and that duck inside a turkey? Was it two butchers in Louisiana? The Romans? A Cajun chef? Or an NFL sportscaster? Peck your answer carefully, and we'll reveal the truth in a moment.
Instead of stuffing, I'm gonna fill the turkey with a slightly smaller turkey. It's called a turkey.
A turkey key?
The name turducken is a portmanteau of turkey, duck, and chicken. The three birds that sacrifice their lives to make a single dish. It takes 45 minutes to debone all the birds before you start assembling the meats. There are layers of traditional stuffing between each layer of bird meat. With a cooking time of 12 hours, this dish is culinary overkill. And I mean every pun stuffed in there. Although it isn't exclusively a Thanksgiving thing, turducken is now a frequent sight on the Thanksgiving menu of many American families. It tastes a bit like a Thanksgiving turkey and stuffing in casserole form with the added flavors of chicken and duck. They all greet your palate in quick succession. You'd better like poultry a lot.
I do like it. I really do.
So who was the first to think that their roast bird dinner could use a bit more, bird? First in line to take credit for this was the Louisiana chef Paul Prudhomme. He claimed to have invented turducken in a Wyoming lodge. Prudhomme trademarked the name turducken, but he hasn't convinced everyone to believe his claim. Then there are the Butcher brothers, Junior and Sammy Herbert, from Louisiana's Herbert Specialty Meats. They call their shop the home of the world-famous turducken. And they claim to have invented turducken when a local man brought the birds to their shop and requested the combination. But the idea of stuffing food items inside each other and cooking them together is not all that original. It's called engastration. It sounds so appetizing. The Roman scholar Macrobius was the first person to record engastration in the 5th century. The Trojan boar packed an army of other animals inside a pig. Recipes from around the same time include a cow stuffed with a pig, a goose, a duck, and a chicken. Fast forward to the 18th century, and you'll find the Yorkshire Christmas pie. The pie requires a slightly off-kilter cook to spend several hours deboning a turkey, a guinea fowl, a partridge, and a pigeon, then stuffing them inside each other. This pie takes 4 hours to bake. If you think that's some extreme cooking, wait till you hear of this. In 1807, food critic Alexandre Balthazar Laurent Grimaud de la Reynière drew inspiration from some 5th century recipes to create a dish even more elaborate than his name. He called it rôti sans pareil, or roast without equal. It involves deboning and stuffing 17 birds inside each other like matryoshka dolls. The cook starts with a tiny garden warbler and ends with a great bustard. Why would anyone want to spend 10 hours cooking an entire garden of birds? It might comfort you to know that engastration-based recipes like these have never been popular. Chefs created such outrageous decadence to thrill and pander to the most affluent 1% of society. But fast forward again to the year 1997. Turducken has caught on in the US again. It became popular after NFL sportscaster John Madden carved a turducken during a Thanksgiving football broadcast that year. But as to who really invented turducken, no one seems to know for sure. So what other crazy bird dinner would you be willing to try? How about some crow meat in your pie? We've got that covered in another episode of Origins of Food.